r/askreddit. Serious, police officers and nurses, what's the most fucked up thing you have seen on the job? Used to work at a naval hospital. Apparently artillery marines used to have this hazing tradition called kissing the breech. Essentially, the M777, 155 howitzer artillery guns, like any gun, have a massive recoil and the new marines would put their face as close to the recoil as possible. Apparently, this was fairly common, but honestly I never heard of it again after this. So this good looking, 19-year-old boot actually kissed the breech. The gun recoiled and smacked him in the face. He transferred to our hospital one day after the incident and it was the worst injury I have ever seen to this day. He somehow survived being hit in the face by the recoil of a round capable of traveling 25 miles. This thing weighs like 9,000 pounds and hit him in the face with little cannon force. He makes it to hospital and I couldn't believe my eyes. He essentially had lost his entire face. No eyes, mouth, nose, chin. Nothing. A gaping hole with tubes and surgical dressings. I was part of a team responsible for stabilizing him and never heard the outcome, but I know he survived for quite some time. He may have made it back home. I hope he is still around. He had a great family around him and the hardest part was seeing his mother holding pictures of her son before the incident happened. Heartbreaking. Edit. Some other sources have informed me that some of my information was incorrect. The word we received at the hospital was this kissing the breech hazing story, but apparently one of the leadership was charged with gross negligence. This was a mechanical malfunction that should have been checked and was not, resulting in the mishap. Thanks you Victor Sierra for the info. His comment below explains what went wrong for you arty guys. Mate, if I lose my face I definitely want to be put to sleep. Jesus Christ. Hazing in itself is ridiculous, but who the hell thought this was a rad idea for hazing the new guys? Homeless person with an infected foot just came in last month. Foot was red and necrotic, dead tissue. Little black holes everywhere. Poured some iodine and a few maggots came out. Another nurse suggested hydrogen peroxide, that hole bubbled and 1,000s of maggots came bursting out. I can't even describe the smell. Oh no. I'm gagging just thinking of the image. Did vomiting ensue? Young girl in her 20s kidnapped and held captive for days. Every inch of her was bruised. They shaved her head and eyebrows off, burnt her. Just some seriously fucked up stuff. Only found by chance. I don't want to imagine what would have happened if she wasn't. No family came to see her either. She was truly isolated and alone with no support. I think that just made it so much worse. No family came to see her either. She was truly isolated and alone with no support. I think that just made it so much worse. That's unfortunately probably what made her a target for the kidnappers. I read a story about a Japanese schoolgirl that had this happen, except I think she was alive for weeks or months. It's terrifying that humans are capable of such sadism. One of my patients sneezed out his intestines. He had a hernia so severe the skin had stretched to the breaking point, so all it took was a sudden increase in abdominal pressure and bam. Edit. To elaborate. He had had multiple surgeries to repair the hernia in the past that all failed. He came into the hospital looking like he had swallowed a basketball. The skin around his belly was very thin and damaged, so all it took was a sneeze to rip the skin and all of his bowels came shooting out. Not a single loop of bowel. Basically all of it, since he had little support in there at all to keep them in place. He survived the initial trauma, since evisceration is not as immediately fatal as it may look if the bowel is undamaged, but I think he had a very poor long-term prognosis. Sounds like something out of a horror movie. Oh no. I work in an operating room. Patient came in for surgery. Was using a loaded gun as a sex toy up her rectum, and it went off as she was doing the deed. Shot through her abdomen. Yeah, I see some weird shit come through. Why in the ever-loving fug? Was in the ER. A young girl was brought in, beaten and messed up. She was alert and oriented though, and was fighting with paramedics and ER staff about assessing her. Turns out she was only 12 or 13 years old, beaten by an uncle, and refused to say anything until her daddy showed up. Of course no one showed up, at least, when I last checked at the end of my 12-hour shift. Things that happens to children are the most fucked up. Do you think his was human trafficking? Prostitution? Got a call of medical aid request. Male subject and chainsaw related injury. Showed up and found a male in the middle of the street, head in one place, body in another. Chainsaw still running. Guy had found out his wife was cheating on him with his own brother, got drunk, put the chainsaw up to his throat to show them a lesson. The chainsaw teeth caught his neck and just kept going. Wonder what medical aid they thought you were going to be able to deliver at that point? On my first clinical there was a 7-year-old kid who came to the ER on a psych call BC. He tried to kill his parents and grandparents. The kid was nice as hell and cried when we put an IV in. Wonder what the parents think of that. He's being scared of an IV but nearly commit multiple counts of murder. I'm old, so this was a long time ago. I looked after someone who had attempted suicide on the train tracks. They survived but lost both their legs. Everyone was just JFC. They were suicidal before and now they are going to be living with a significant disability. This didn't happen in Ontario, Canada, did it? My sister was his friends with someone that did this. Tried to kill himself by laying on the train tracks but it severed his legs. The irony is that it turned his life around afterwards. So I have been a nurse for over 10 years and I have to be honest, so much of my experiences are not as gory or traumatic as so many others here and never will be. But for me, and I know that some of you might understand, the most fucked up things I see and will continue to see is the horror of Alzheimer's, frontal temporal dementia, and Lewy body dementia. I tell you what, these PPL come in and they are polite and confused, able to fake it sometimes. Maybe their families have cared for them at home for a long time. Within hours often they realize they aren't leaving and the family is gone. The facade is over. They become mean and nasty often. Or the traumatic weight loss, the refusing to eat, the empty look in their eyes. Begging to be released from their shell of a body in their own personal hell. Unable to verbalize the pain or confusion or anything they feel. The families going through this is sad too. But what I was reminded of was when some of these folks do get sick, or break a hip, or poop themselves. The amount of people it often takes to help them and clean them up, literally have to try to hold their hands down because they do not understand what's going on no matter what. So yes, imagine 4 minutes and 10 seconds little old lady who is 90 some years old. In the shower, with 2 or 3 staff because she's swinging and pissed off, but hasn't had a shower in over a week, and starts with diarrhea. One girl gets sick, so an old lady grabs the poop and starts smearing it on her, ends up standing on wet floor with other 2 gals and they're trying to hold onto her and keep her off the floor and get her clean, throwing handfuls of poo at the girls, the doorway, and the wall. And here comes Iowa Popcorn RN knocking on the door in her dress clothes as the assistant director of nursing, trying to help people, and gets poo landed at feet. And people wonder why I support assisted suicide. We have a frequent flyer who repeatedly comes in because she gets glass dildos stuck up her ass. She's already had to have emergency surgery twice because they break after she puts them in. She puts them in the freezer first. I guess mine was on New Year's Eve one year. I responded to a code white, aggressive incident, in the psychiatric department. Our hospital is small, so when these incidents happen each floor is required to send 1 staff member to the event. Once I got to the entrance of the psych department, the security guard who I met in the hall looked up from his walkie-talkie and said, "Not this way, fug," and then took us through the garden entrance from the outside of a very snowy hospital. All I heard from the main psych entrance was screaming and banging on the door. Once we got inside we found a patient had punched through all the glass windows in the nursing station, completely degloving his forearms of skin, and was throwing glass shards at the nurses in the station. It was extremely bloody. The whole hall was covered. He was smearing it on his face, clawing at his eyes. We nurses don't really have the tools to deal with patients once weapons are on board, so we called the cops and barricaded ourselves in the medication room. Thank God for steel doors and no windows there. It was a tense couple minutes in there before cops showed up and pepper sprayed him. Then I had the honor of being the dude who got to put compression on his arms and haul him onto the stretcher, huffing pepper spray fumes and getting absolutely howled at. Degloving his forearms. Pepper sprayed him. Ouch. I was a CNA and had been working at a nursing home for about a month. This nursing home was extremely understaffed all the time. On this particular night, I had 60 patients. Yes, you read that right. 60. The closest nurse was on the next section. Very frequently I would be the only staff member on the unit. Things were going okay considering everything. At around 4 AM, I was making my last rounds. I was trying to do my work when a confused woman came up to me insistent that it was 8 AM and she would coffee and toast. I couldn't fetch that for her because the kitchen was closed. I tried to convince her to go to bed but that didn't work. After 20 minutes of this, I heard the voice of a nurse scream for me. I couldn't leave the confused lady, so I put her in a wheelchair and rolled her down to where I can help my nurse and keep an eye on her. The nurse told me she was trying to pass meds when she heard a woman scream. She went running into her room to find one of my patients in a pool of her own blood. This woman was trying to get herself to the bathroom when she slipped. She broke her hip and smacked the back of her head. This woman was my patient but I couldn't get to her in time. I put on gloves, grabbed a washcloth, and applied pressure to her head. Meanwhile the nurse put her hip on a pillow and got vitals. Another CNA called 911. I gave report to the paramedics and they took her to nearest hospital. She came back soon to the nursing home and she was never the same. I believe she got a traumatic brain injury. I don't think much could be done for her because she was 98 when this happened. Before, she was mildly confused. When she came back, she would just lie in her bed and scream. After that shift I told people what happened. The mass amount of blood was hard to miss. I gave report and clocked out. I went out to my car and just cried and cried. To this day, I still haven't cried that hard over a patient. The early morning before, I stayed late after my shift. I works nights. Her and I were talking for about 45 minutes how much we love San Francisco and seafood. She told me about growing up on the coast and about the cute sailor boys. Once I realized management didn't give two shits about this happening due to short staffing, I put in my 2 weeks notice but refused to actually work those 2 weeks. I've worked at a hospital for the last 2 years and am hoping to transfer to ICU. One thing I should have mentioned was that bed alarms was recently cut from the budget. Management said they aren't important. They're also a restraint-free facility. Nobody knew she was even out of bed. I just looked on Medicare Gov and this place has been reported 3 times. Glad I left when I did. Damn. Guy convinced a friend to drill a hole in the back of his head because he read somewhere that it alters the flow of cerebrospinal fluid to give a permanent high without any drugs. Somehow worked out with no bad effects except that he and the friend just left it open for like 2 weeks and the cut edges of his scalp started rotting. I could literally see into the inside of this dude's brain through the dime-size hole he had drilled. Not sure if penetrating the brain itself was intentional or not. But the goddamn shocking thing is that, except for the infection in his scalp, the guy was otherwise completely fine. Told me all about what he did in a totally coherent manner and then extolled the virtues of drilling into your skull over taking drugs. Another wasn't an actual visual saw, just I was there and saw the whole thing unfold. 17-year-old was brought in for a very feeble suicide attempt. Took a few too many Advil or barely scratched her wrists the short way, something along those lines. She seems like a good kid, just depressed. Obviously in need of some help. Then her parents come in. They look fairly affluent. They start telling her how everyone gets sad and she just needs to deal with it. Doctor and mental health professional decide she needs an inpatient stay. Girl agrees she needs this. Parents refuse. They don't need their daughter sent away with the crazies. Doctor has to get an emergency custody order to have her inpatient. Parents leave throwing a fit, threatening to sue, etc. Once they're gone and the girl realizes she will be getting help, the look of relief on her face was amazing. Mental health worker comes in and talks with her about how she'll be 18 and graduating soon and to just hang in there for a few months. This was probably 3-4 years ago and I really hope she's doing well. I was a CNA. I found an old woman floating in a couple inches of her blood in the bathroom. She slipped. Hit her head on the sink. Passed out. Got up. Slipped in her blood and hit her head on the toilet. She got up a 3rd time and hit her head again. It straight up looked like a murder with all the blood. My co-worker was telling me to check her blood pressure. I just looked at her and said the medics will be here soon. I don't want to move her. Her blood pressure is probably low. My co-worker was pissed. I grabbed as many towels as I could find to help not ruin the carpet. Assisted the medics as best I could. And off she went to the hospital. She ended up living for a few more years after that before dying of old age. I've never seen that much blood before. The air had this weird iron blood taste to it. It was supremely fucked up. I once had a patient who was suffering from an addiction to alcohol and cocaine. He had snorted so much cocaine that his entire nose was gone. The amount of nose you see on a skull was the same amount what he had left. Also, because he smoked 2 packs a day for over 30 years, his pharynx, throat, wasn't functioning properly. Therefore, he had to be tube fed. Now usually when patients are tube fed, this is done with a probe through the nose and into his stomach. Now the probe was just loosely hanging out of his nose socket. If you would pull it a bit, you could see stuff moving in the back of his head. Because of the substance abuse, this patient had significant liver failure and could not qualify for a liver transplant. Now there is a certain enzyme your liver produces which is responsible for keeping the pressure and the amount of fluids in your cells at a normal amount. Due to his liver damage, this enzyme could not be produced anymore, or at least his liver produces way too less of it. So, over the course of a couple of days he began to swell up. His legs, his belly, his arms, basically everything was full of fluid. During his stay in the hospital, he gained almost 40 pounds of excess fluids which just accumulated in his body. Because of this, his skin was stretching a lot, which caused excruciating pains for the man. Even the strongest morphine could hardly ease the pain. Fortunately for him, he died after a couple of days. There was no way to live. Edit. It was a certain protein which his liver could not produce anymore. Cop here. Off the top of my head. Someone was carjacked and shot twice in the face and once in the back of his head at point blank range. When I saw him, most of his face and a large part of the back of his head was missing. He was not recognizable at all. It's a major holiday. CPR in progress. Medics come rushing through the door working on this cold toddler. Doctor calls it 20 minutes later. The inhuman screams from the mother were just the first part. The screams from the dad and his subsequent hospitalization from the shock were the second. The wails just never leave you. I, cop, got to see a chunk of my left testicle hanging out after I got shot at work. Got hit with 9 buckshot pellets about the size of a marble. My left leg's quad and thigh was absolutely demolished for quite a while, but luckily only one went in my femur, and another stopped a centimeter from my femoral artery. Hell of a toss up between death or a 10-month vacation. Glad I got the vacation even though physical therapy sucked almost as bad as getting shot. EMT. The worst was the first child death I got called to. These young parents were bedsharing with their baby and the covers got up over his face and he suffocated from the carbon monoxide. I'll never forget the mom's screams or how the baby felt when I picked him up. The baby was so far gone resuscitation was pointless, but we attempted it anyway for the parents. My partner had to pull her off of me because she was beating her fists against my back begging me to save him. He was 2 months old. For the dicks who inevitably think bedsharing is completely safe as long as you're sober and blame the parents for drugs drinking, they were sober. They had tox screens done. The medical examiner determined the baby was not rolled on top of